Are you ready to unleash your full potential and become unstoppable in your success and leadership?
Welcome to the Unleashed and Unstoppable podcast, where we provide powerful insights and strategies for coaches, corporate leaders, and entrepreneurs. I'm Alexanne Carter.
And I'm Carol Register, and we're certified master neurocoaches who are passionate about helping you overcome your limiting beliefs and optimize your performance.
Each week, we'll be sharing actionable tips and strategies using neuroscience, from interviews with industry experts to solo episodes, to help you lead a life of power, purpose, and possibility on your own terms.
Join our community of like-minded individuals. Hit subscribe now, and let's be unleashed and unstoppable together.
Hey, wildly ambitious leader. Welcome back to the Unleashed and Unstoppable podcast. Carol and I are so excited that you're joining us today with our special guest, Kimberly Spencer. She is a phenomenal, amazing leader, mom, multiple author, and just an overall badass leader. And a client of mine introduced me to Kim a few months ago and was like, I have a friend of mine that I've got to introduce you to. And her and I connected, and I saw immediately right away exactly why my client thought of Kim as being someone to be in connection with. And right off the bat, when we started chatting, I was like, Carol, we get to have Kim on this podcast speaking to our amazing community of high-achieving female leaders. So I know recently you published your very first book, which is Make Every Podcast Want You. So no, we definitely want to dive into learning a bit about you, Kim, your story, your journey, and to unpack what that, podcasting, speaking, really looking at that as another source of income as you grow your business, and really looking at, this multiple streams of income that are available. Because believe it or not, podcasting and speaking on other people's podcasts and even running your own podcast is a way that you can earn an income and money these days. So yeah, why don't you introduce yourself, Kim, and then we'll dive in.
Yeah, thank you, Alex and Carol, so much for having me. I'm so honored to be here with your audience. Speaking to high achieving leaders, I'm like, that's my jam. So let me take you back to 2020, which is actually where I got to meet your client, Alex, who's a dear, dear friend of mine. She's actually the first person to babysit my son.
Oh,
because we were over in Australia, and my husband is a voice actor, so he appears at all these Comic-Cons. And so we were over there for just a 3-week vacation, and we landed in the Gold Coast right when Tom Hanks said he had COVID. And we're like, we've always wanted to live abroad. And we thought, well, my business was my coaching business, Crown Yourself, was at a space where I was like, I can support us if your industry shuts down. And so we just decided to lean into that vision and live abroad in Australia. And we thought, how long could this last? It was 2 weeks to flatten the curve, right? And turned out 2 weeks turned into 2 years, where not only did I get to live abroad, fully support my family, get to put my husband through his dream of chef school. And then I got pregnant and I ate his homework, which I think is genius strategy. And then got a TED Talk over there. And this amazing opportunity of podcast guesting really came out of necessity, because of my visa, and because of COVID, no live events were taking place. And that was previously how I had generated business for my coaching company. And so my team and I were looking to pivot, and we tried doubling down on our own podcast, the Crown Yourself podcast, which we'd had since 2019. And it was doing well for generating retention and building community, but it was not really great for new lead generation. And that was when I remembered a podcast interview that I had done back in 2019 that had resulted in a $10,000 coaching contract. And I said, well, what if we just double down on podcast guesting? Fast forward 50 interviews later, and it generated over $70,000 of new business revenue. It's now done over $250,000 in new business revenue just from podcast guesting alone. And the trick comes, and it's not really a super secret trick, but the magic comes from just like what you experience, like both of you, Carol and Alex, like with your mentor and being in the podcast space and having a podcast conversation and then getting to be connected and building relationships. Because if you think about it, a podcast host is constantly talking to people. And
Mhm.
ideally, if you're getting on the right podcast, those podcasts can be an opportunity for you to be in the referral circle of that podcast host.
Yeah.
And this is how we've
Mm.
seen not only with my business, but then with now with our agency, with our done for you services, with our clients, this is how we've seen our clients generate referrals, speaking opportunities, JV partnerships, getting clients even before their podcast episode distributes, because they don't think of the podcast interview as like a one night visibility stand where it's like, thanks for the interview, bye, and then you never speak to the podcast host again. It's actually building a quality relationship that develops, and it's built on mutual generosity and reciprocity. And when you do that,
Wow.
the transformational possibilities for your business are endless.
That's so
Wow.
cool. That's amazing. I mean, you just listed so many things there and a huge amount of income. How exciting is that to hear about the possibilities for increased income coming through the door simply by being a guest on podcasts? And would you take us deeper on the way that you go about doing that? How do you start to become a podcast guest? How do you make yourself known?
Yeah, so first, the how we look at it is who are the podcasts that you're targeting? Because most people get this part wrong. And
Mm.
I've seen this, I give the example in my book of health coaches going on health coaching podcasts. And I did this wrong too, because believe me, this was a lot of trial and error in the beginning of 2020 and 2021, where my team was like, just go on every podcast. And I said yes to every podcast. And eventually, what I started to recognize is just like in every other industry, podcasting as an industry, 90% of podcasts aren't worth your time as a business owner, simply
Mm.
because 90% of podcasts don't make it past 10 episodes. So if you're
That's
looking for,
incredible.
yeah, I
Yeah.
know, right? It's like, if you just make it past 10 episodes, you're in the top 10% of podcasts, period. So it's a testament to, like, if you have consistency and longevity as a value in your business, as and maybe not one of your core values, but you are not in business for the short term Instagram, I hit 10K months in 2 seconds wins, which is great, and those can happen. And you're also thinking of business, being in business for the long term. Podcasting is a wonderful strategy for long term business strategy, but it's a long term strategy. So
Yeah.
how a lot of people get podcast guesting wrong is they're going on the podcasts that are built for their industry. So I went on a ton of
Mm.
coaching podcasts for coaches, and I didn't see a single ROI from those podcasts.
Mhm.
When I started to shift and go on productivity podcasts, because as a high performance coach for the past 9 years, like I would talk about productivity in a different way based in more feminine embodiment principles. Because especially as a mother, like the
Wow.
9 to 5 grind, like it ain't I'm getting interrupted by a 7-year-old at some point.
Yeah.
Someone's or a 3-year-old is gonna like show up at some point and want something from me. So the concepts of productivity that I would teach on those podcasts were different than those more masculine roles, and they attracted my ideal clients because my message was more
Mm.
polarizing, because it was
Mm.
different than everything else that they'd heard. And
Wow.
so I would target my avatar podcast, and this is a big one, especially depending upon the industry. So we had a client who was a divorce attorney, and she'd gone on all the top divorce podcasts, and she had not seen a dime from revenue. And I said, well, yeah, because when does an audience member listen to a divorce podcast? And she was like, well, when they're getting divorced. I said, exactly. And when they're getting divorced, do they probably already have a lawyer? She goes, oh, yeah. So when we started looking at when your ideal customer comes to you in
Mhm.
their journey, those are the podcasts. So I said, we don't need to get you on divorce podcasts. We need to get you on relationship and marriage podcasts, talking about here are the signs of divorce. If you're considering divorce, here's some
Wow.
conscious uncoupling ways and conversation starters that you can have to easily, because her specialty was in really conscious divorce and making it so that there's not this like gigantic 2-year battle for the kids,
Mhm.
and really making it an amicable separation where two parents can actively co-parent together, which I love.
Yeah.
So I said, focus on these speaking topics and then go on marriage podcasts. That's when she started to see an ROI. But you
Wow.
have to know when your ideal customer is coming to you. And then the third piece of what podcasts to target are everybody's going to like, you may have people who have the same ideal customer avatar, and you definitely will have people that are in the same industry as you, but nobody has your story. So
Yeah.
I bet that there are some unique aspects to your story, whether you're a single mom, whether you're LGBTQIA, whether you are, a solo parent, the child of an addict, a recovered addict, whether there are so many interesting pieces of your own story and your own journey that those can be niche micro targeted podcasts that you can target to go on. Like we have one of our clients who was diagnosed late in life. He's an incredibly successful entrepreneur, and yet he was diagnosed late in life with autism and dyslexia, and he's built like massive businesses. And so we started targeting those specific podcasts to be able to have his episodes be a testimony for what's possible for people who have
Wow.
autism or have some form of neurodivergence.
It's powerful when you think about that. It's like it's funny. I was having a conversation with my husband earlier about, really thinking about where is that ideal, like that ideal person at that point, right? And so it was a beautiful conversation, but it's just that question, and it's a beautiful, it's like even around the coffee, not the coffee table, sorry, the dinner table, you can just having that question of like, really, at what point do you want to get in? Because you're right. I think the automatic is like, health coach or neuro coach or productivity coach,
Yeah.
to go on all that, what seems really straightforward,
Mhm.
but it is thinking about outside the box with who you speak to, how you speak to them, and that story piece. Now, Kim, you and I remember in our conversation we had a couple weeks ago, you talked a little bit about how there's like kind of a right way to tell a story, and not that there's a wrong way, but you're like, this is what can help with a successful telling of a story. And this is where I see a lot of people kind of are less successful, right? With when they're on podcasts. And this is kind of what will make or break it, helping you turn your podcast interview into something that has an ROI versus those that tend to maybe fall flat at the end of them. Do you mind speaking into that a little bit to help our listener to, lean into that a little bit more
Absolutely.
and know what to watch out for, right, when they're speaking?
So there's a reason why I opened up sharing my biography of like who I am and what I do through the vein of a story. And that's strategic, but it's also highly practical. Like
Yeah.
I'm very used to storytelling, but just the act of telling a story, and I know your audience, because you love neuroscience, will geek out on this. Just the act of even saying, can I tell you a story, or I'm going to tell you a story, it converts short-term memory into long-term memory. It sparks a little bit of oxytocin in the brain. And so you get all these good feel-good hormones coming from just the fact that you're learning from a story. The other thing with storytelling is you bypass cognitive bias, where
Mhm.
people can list their facts and their strategies and their tips and tricks all day, but so often we'll have, oh, well, that's nice for her. It worked for her, but how can it, that's great. I don't know if this will work for me is a common sales objection in any sales conversation. And a
Yeah.
story can bypass that because you're demonstrating through you as the vessel, as the storyteller, whether it's an example of your own or an example of a client of yours, of how they've achieved XYZ results that you deliver in your coaching practice or in your business. When you tell it through the lens of a story, it bypasses that cognitive bias of like, I don't know if this is going to work for me, because you're starting to hear those social proof testimonials already baked in, which is
Mm.
one of the things that I work with my clients on specifically, of like, how can we leverage in NLP, it's called metaphors. It's not the traditional form of a metaphor, like the grammar, like as my book editor was like, she's like, this isn't actually a metaphor. And I was like, it's a metaphor in NLP. Like, so in neurolinguistic programming, it's called embedding a metaphor. And I give a really specific example of how to do this, where you look at the belief systems, habits, thought patterns, emotions of your ideal customer. And then you look at what is the desired result that they're looking for, and what are the belief patterns, the thought patterns, the emotions, and the habits that they have to have at that point. And then you speak to that journey and that arc consistently throughout your interview as you are demonstrating those results with story after story after story. So I build up with my clients and having a backlog of stories. One of my favorite was building one with a bookkeeper client of ours who she was like, right, it was right around tax season. She's like, I don't really like all our clients right now. And I said, well, this is a good time to reflect with gratitude. So we were able to look through and see just some of the massive successes that she was able to create for her clients, including helping them get enough profit so they could start a second, restaurant, like
Wow.
massive. But those
Yeah.
stories, they have that exactly, Carol. They have that like wow effect. And when you can have that wow effect, that's what makes the audience want to pay more attention because they are invested in the story and in the result, and it makes people lean in.
I really love that. And, one of the things that um, can be a simple way that I've found to go about that is to use a formula, if you will, that you can fit the pieces into. And it sounds very similar to that. Are you licensed or certified in neurolinguistic programming? What Alex and I do with neurocoaching, we literally help people by going into the neural networks, giving you a series of tools to be able to do the synaptic pruning or the removal of limiting beliefs and the wiring in of the new success beliefs and creating that neural superhighway. So that's now your new default zone. So I know that's really similar to NLP, but since you included that, is that a big part of how you do the storytelling, as you were saying, with the metaphors? What does that look like exactly?
Yeah, so NLP, I've been a master certified practitioner since master for the past few years, and then I've been practicing it since 2016 in my coaching practice, to phenomenal results that my clients have had, as well as hypnosis and timeline therapy.
Wow.
I'm kind of a certification junkie. Like every year, I kind of add on something else, like biodynamic breathwork and trauma release, certified high performance
Wow.
coaching. I love really studying all the modalities because I
Yeah.
create a very individualized coaching approach for my clients. And I want to make sure that they if there's a problem, there's 15 different ways to find solutions for that.
Mm.
What gets us stuck so often is when we think there's only the right best one way that we can solve
Yeah.
that problem.
Yeah.
And so I think as coaches, it's almost our job to expand the realm of possibility. So
Mm.
anything that I can do to support that, that's my jam. With NLP, how I love leveraging NLP in terms of marketing, because it was invented by, created and discovered by two magicians. So sleight of hand and understanding illusion and understanding how to craft a belief shift and change in the mindset simply by looking at story. There's another NLP technique I share of switching the referential index, which is a very simple linguistic communication technique. Switching the referential index is basically if I'm telling you a story and I'm saying off the cuff, like practice. If I'm telling you a story of like, I was stuck in Australia and then fast forward, I generated over $250,000 in new business revenue from guest podcasting. And what I discovered is that when you just start sharing your story and you connect on a deeper level, that's how you can start profiting from guest podcasting. Well, what I just did there was a quick little tiny linguistic reframe. And this is what Tony Robbins is like a master of. Is I switched the story. Initially, I was telling the story in the form of I. And when I got to the point that I wanted you to grasp onto, I switched it to a you. And so that way, you as the audience are receiving that message and that kapow. But because it's been embedded in the form of a story with it bypasses that cognitive dissonance. So you actually, the message lands deeper of, oh, yes, I can too profit from guest podcasting period, end of story,
Yeah.
without, and here's the example as to why.
I love
Yeah.
that. I was gonna say, Carol
Yeah.
and I are often having
Yeah.
discussion, like, especially like when you first started speaking. I remember that I'd be really guilty of like I, because that's kind of what I sort of knew. And just training, it's training. I gotta say it's training the brain. I mean, it is, it's training the brain, it's training to deliver something in a way that isn't automatic. And so, of course, I love the fact that you've tied in, right? I mean, NLP, it's still neuroscience, it's still the brain
Yeah.
work, right? So of course we're geeking out on this because we love unpacking. Like it's just going deeper into that awareness piece. And so when you have that awareness, I always think it's an art. It's an art, it's a craft. And I feel like it probably does take a little trial and error, right? Because there is a
Yeah.
lot of, practicing and seeing what lands and what doesn't land. I know Carol and I are always revising, like even when we're doing our interviews back and forth between Carol and myself, when we have guests on, right? Of like of creating that and bringing that in. And do you have like just speaking into that because you share your story and it's like, oh my goodness, I can go and be a podcast guest and that can bring in all this revenue. Like speaking into it a little bit more to support. You did mention it's a long-term game. So just really setting the listener up for success. So when they're listening to this, they're like, okay, so this is it's possible. It sounds exciting. I love speaking. So what does this really look like to bring this into, one of my ways that I can monetize my expertise and understanding what I'm getting myself into. Because I think that can help, it's like, sounds great. And there's a little bit more than, I guess, booking podcasts and speaking and telling a story, right?
Yes, it's like yes, and is my favorite frame of reference. It's a yes, and it's yes, you need to get booked on podcasts, and that's a great way to grow your brand awareness, grow your audience size, and you can convert. I've literally gone on podcasts and had people show up in my DMs of like, I want to work with you because I heard you on X, Y, and Z podcast. That can happen. However, in my book, I list all of the ways to profit from guest podcasting, and there's a multitude of ways. Very rarely, I want to clear up any thought is typically I've never heard of a podcast guest getting paid to speak on a podcast, except actually Ty Lopez. He's the only and that's only because I saw his paid ads running and it was like, oh, have Ty Lopez on your podcast, and it was like pay him like $20,000 or something like that. I was like, oh, that's how you can get paid to be on a podcast. But the podcaster then gets the benefit of being able to say they have someone of Ty Lopez's caliber and expertise on their show, which then adds credibility to the show. So it's kind of like paying for that credibility. If you don't have that yet, you don't have a massive amount of top podcasts. It is a longer term strategy. So I'll give you one of the strategies that I leverage and that I share about in the book. I was on this one woman's podcast. We had a great rapport. And I said, your audience is very similar to a service that I offer, because her audience, she was a journaling coach. And I said, well, my work that I do with business owners is a little deeper. So like you can get them started with shifting their mindset. And then my work, I take them into the mindset of like being a business owner and growing and scaling a high performance business. And she said, oh, okay, that'd be a great collaboration. And I said, well, let's teach a masterclass together. So what we did is I did the podcast interview, which set up as promotion for a free masterclass for her inbound community. So we were promoting for her community. Anybody who came in from that community, then who chose to buy my consult or then upsell into the full coaching program, she then got 20%. And so that is a way to form these strategic partnerships, because I like to think of a podcast interview really like a first date. It's like you don't know if someone's going to be, it's kind of like you're learning each other, but you're still spending 20 minutes to an hour with someone that you are getting to know. And when you're in that space, there can be collaborative potential. Oh, I really liked what you said on that thing. And I think that could be something that's beneficial for my audience. The last one that I always give, because I've seen this strategy, I don't know who teaches it, but I've seen it play out. It has worked for me. I will say that it has worked, but the podcast host can become a client, but do not go on the podcast with the intention of that happening. You will get your episode thrown in the trash. I've gone on podcasts where the conversation evolved naturally to a couple emails down the road. It was like, I'm curious, you gave a lot of value on my podcast, and I'd love
Yeah.
to explore what this could be beyond this. I've also had that on my own podcast, because especially when you have your own podcast and you're asking quality questions like a coach does,
Yeah.
it positions you as someone who can ask quality questions. And I love the fact that on my podcast, I've had people say, oh, I've never been asked that before. And it allows them to
Yeah.
think. And then that sometimes can generate and lead into further business for your business. But do not hard sell if you have your own podcast on an episode. That's a hard pass for us as an agency. We throw people literally podcasters literally in the dungeon if we hear that they do that to our clients.
Yeah.
Where we don't call them, they're on our do not call list, because we don't want our clients to feel uncomfortable about being hard sold after an episode, especially if it's like almost at the threat that their episode and their hour of time that they've spent might go wasted because if they don't choose to go for the upsell. It's gross. So
That's so powerful. I mean, it's super interesting first of all, you want to look at the right audience that you need to get in front of, and craft your story, and how this is so intriguing, of course. Totally geeking out, Alex, how it bypasses our cognitive biases, our cognitive dissonance that we have, and the way to do a little refrain. I mean, you've given us so much right here. There are two things that I am dying to ask you right now. One is not only podcast guesting, and I know that's our focus here, but also, do you help speakers craft their message specifically? And do you help people find stages other than podcasts? That's one question. And the second I'll throw in there is, you mentioned an agency. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so I don't help get people booked on other stages. I have gotten booked on multiple stages. I've done everything from a TEDx to speaking in front of large conferences and whatnot. But that's not my zone of genius. My zone of genius is really seeing how people communicate and how they're not only telling the stories that they have in their own head, and then developing their communication into a powerful platform, so that the communication and the messaging is very consistent between what they're saying online, what they're saying on a podcast, what they're saying in their speeches or on larger stages, and making sure they have cohesion between all of their branding, and that's aligning with the vision of who they want to be too, because I see that a lot with a level of congruence of sometimes people are sharing a message, but that message was resonant 6 years ago, and no longer is it present for who their ideal customer is and who they are today either. And so that's really powerful. With our agency, we actually are pivoting, especially since, like Alex mentioned earlier before we hopped on recording, like I'm having another baby. This will be number 3. Yay! We are pivoting actually away from the done for you full services and moving into a done with you. We did initially, to launch the company Communication Queens, we did a done by you, where we launched a course that trained people on how to get booked on podcasts. We then had a successful launch. clients were getting great results, getting booked on podcasts even before they'd had their ordered their microphones. It was phenomenal. And then we had another launch and it just bombed. And I also think that was also my energy at the time, quite frankly, because I was going through a lot of family loss at that time back in 2021, 2022.
I'm so
But
sorry.
yeah, it was definitely it was a year of initiation. I lost 3 family members, including my father,
Wow.
moved countries and had a baby and grew my coaching business an extra 150%. I was like, oh
Wow.
God.
Wow.
But after that and the dust kind of settled, I pulled my audience and I said, well, you didn't, go all gung ho for this Communication Queens course. What do you want? And they're like, well, we want somebody to really do it for us. Which is how we came up with the agency model. And we've done that model for 2 years to varying degrees of success. We've gotten our clients on massive podcasts, the #1 entrepreneur podcast in the world.
Whoa.
And
Yeah.
yes, and
Woo.
gotten them booked on podcasts that we saw that the model doesn't just work for me, it works for other clients when they follow the model. The only time we've ever had clients not have success is when they don't follow the model and they don't follow up with their podcasters. I'm like, well, you're kind of not following the system. So if you don't follow the system, it's not going to work. But
Surprise.
surprise, right? Like if you don't change your belief systems around it, if you don't change your habits, you're kind of going to get the same results. But with having this baby and seeing the trends of the industry, what we're doing is we have seen so much more success with training teams in getting their own VAs to support them in getting booked on podcasts, because the worst pitches a podcaster will get, and I have this having 2 top podcasts, are from untrained VAs. And yet the higher level of engagement comes from internal pitches from a company. And so that's how we're pivoting. And so I haven't shared this like publicly. This is only a new development in the past couple of weeks. You're the first
You
to
heard
hear
it
this.
here first. Yeah.
But we're shifting the model into really being able to train the business owner and the team as a whole, as a holistic unit, to say, this is a strategy to implement. It's a long-term strategy. We're going to support you through the strategy,
Wow.
and being able to start to see the results that you can get. We just love and have seen more positive results with pitches coming internally from a team, because so many podcasters are getting pitches these days. And when it comes from an agency or an outsourced VA, very often they are not as well received unless you have the relationships. Unfortunately, we've been able to build up the relationships because of the strategy, because our strategy is rooted in relationships first.
Wow. Wow. That rooting it in relationships first, right? I mean, and looking at it from the big picture and from the long-term point of view, to be able to continue to use this strategy to not just have a one and done or a temporary solution is so incredibly powerful. And, if I wanted to go and get on somebody's podcast right now, you mentioned, the key things that are so important, and revisiting those, making sure that I'm in front of the right audiences, crafting my story in a way that is really speaking to that person, bypassing their cognitive biases and inviting them in, right? And then to be able to go out and do that is obviously an agency. Working with an agency is extremely valuable, and you just highlighted that. But what would I do? What step would I take right now to go tomorrow and get to be a guest on somebody's podcast?
So first and foremost, I recommend grabbing the book because the book will walk you through. The book literally lays out every single step of the plan that you can architect exactly.
That is so good. So good.
It's amazing because when people see a book, so often nowadays it's like it's an 80-page thing. And I'm like, no, this is a 300-page strategy with references and neuroscience baked in, because I get nerdy about neuroscience just as much as y'all do.
Yes.
So So it has the systems baked into it. And every business owner that I've had that has read the book has said this is a play-by-play book
Wow.
to literally give you the exact system to leverage. And then we have 10 bonus resources as well when you get your copy of the book that
Wow.
literally have the exact system that we've used. It has every source that we've used so that you have all the tools you need to have success.
10 bonuses. That's
Mhm.
incredible. All right. That number's winning me over. I'm like, 10 bonuses? I want to know what the bonuses are. Do you want to know what the bonuses are?
One includes a list of 10,000 podcasters that you can start reaching out to right away.
Okay.
There you go. I mean, that's what you said. The first step to get started is right there, right?
Yep. Yeah. You just got to ask. And I was having a conversation with a really large podcaster yesterday and about just being able to grow their podcast. And I said, well, guesting is one of the ways that I would recommend.
Mhm.
And I said, you have the numbers to be able to be going on some pretty large podcasts. I said, what's genuinely been stopping you? And it was
Mhm.
imposter syndrome. So it all went back to the mindset of the business owner. It all went back to the mindset of, do you believe that your voice deserves to be heard on a larger stage? And
Mm.
ultimately that it comes down to that question. And that
Wow.
you have a message that's valuable and a story to share that can actually serve and save lives. And I have seen how my story personally has literally saved lives. I've seen how storytelling can save lives. So there is power in your story. And when you can bypass that imposter syndrome, which, by the way, according to my friend Jen Kochen, it imposter syndrome, any time you feel that, it's just a sign that you are in the right room
Yeah.
choosing to play at a higher level. It's
Yeah.
not, if you don't feel imposter syndrome, you're not playing big enough.
Yeah.
And when you can think about it with that reframe, then approaching these larger podcasts, the worst they can say is no. And the best they can say is we'll book you in 3 to 6 months from now, because typically that's when they're booking out to. But those, there is power in sharing your story. And through being able to speak to this very large podcaster, it was so cool to see just his eyes open of like, wow, I just haven't been making the ask. And it really comes down,
Mm.
every level of success of anything that you want, it just is on this other side of your next big ask. You just
Wow.
have to ask for it.
Take that
How,
courage, right? Right. Taking
yeah.
that courage and just really leaning into that. As you're speaking there, Kimberly, about the imposter syndrome, something that came to mind, and we spoke a little bit about it when you and I chatted a couple weeks ago, right? Something we know is a confused mind doesn't buy.
Yeah.
And a
Mhm.
lot of our listeners like are own multiple businesses, maybe in corporate and also do things on the side. So those that are listening and are like, okay, this sounds great, but I have multiple things. And if a confused mind doesn't buy, sorry, how do I show up now with this sort of personal brand so that people see me and I can still make this,
Yeah.
some revenue from this where there's clarity, and so I'm not creating confusion in the listener who's listening to my story.
I love that question, Alex, because a lot of times we've gotten the idea of niching wrong.
Mm,
Like we perceive, oh, as a marketer, I thus can only speak to marketing and I can't speak to the
Mm.
fact that like I also am a mom, I also am a business owner. Like I am I own two companies and I'm a partner in a third. And I'm also coming out like with you, Alex, like a children's book in next year called It's Just a Fart. And
Yay.
I wrote that as a love letter to my first son. But
Oh,
the thing that I see about, because he was scared of his farts when he was born. So
oh, I
I wrote it
love
for him back
it.
then. It was just,
Oh,
yeah. And I can't tell you how many podcasters, um, when they read my bio or they see, you know, bestseller, TEDx speaker, all of these have been in Forbes, all these major things, and they're like, and author of the upcoming fart book. Like that actually, if you can make someone laugh or have some sort of sensuous desire, we're just going to put it that way to keep it PG,
yeah.
it actually has the greatest level of memory retention in the brain.
Mm.
So that little bit of laughter, it makes me memorable because it's
mm,
something that's different and shocking and a little weird.
Yeah.
And but it's a memorable thing. So one of the questions that we ask all of our clients is, what is something weird or different or maybe a little crazy about you that no one would know? And those little things, when you can embed those into your bio or into your who you are, they create a holistic picture of who you are. No longer are we these one-dimensional marketing. That's so 2020, quite frankly, is the one-dimensional, here's a box of this is the thing that you need to be in, and here's your niche, and only stay in communicating to this niche. And there is a great book that I reference in my book called You Are the Brand by Mike Kim. And you are the brand. You are the niche.
Yeah.
So you will attract those to you by just fully being all of you and not trying to hide all those pieces. I show workouts in my Instagram stories, even at 6 months pregnant, because fitness is a huge part of neuroscience, is a huge part of mindset. And it was actually that which got me in to coaching. Was my first business when I was 19 was I was a Pilates instructor for 10 years, and I had a private studio. And that was the foundation because it trained my parasympathetic nervous system. So there's all these other pieces that filter into the story of who I am today and how I coach and how I show up as a business leader and as an entrepreneur. And when we can stop segregating the parts of ourselves to appease everyone because they don't understand who we are, and instead trust that by embracing actually all of our uniqueness and all of our creativity and all of our specialness into one holistic brand, it actually can attract more than you buy. That it actually can attract more people into our world because they see the holistic picture. I've seen more and more, especially on transparency and authenticity, especially in social media, and especially in the past years, and I see the trend going into 2025, is more often people are wanting a show, not just tell. And I see that with podcasters. I see that with coaching. I see that with entrepreneurs. They want people showing the results. They want people showing, oh, you say you're a successful CEO? Show us your profit margins. Like, show us the revenue growth of your business. Show us these pieces so that you can be that demonstration rather than, because I think we're all just tired of the marketers on the interwebs who have promised the world, and then you just get to be in their vibe. And you're like, what am I actually getting? And you're not actually getting substance or proof or strategy or tactics or anything that actually has meat to it. You're just like served air on a plate. It's kind of like my husband just the other day told me of a sculpture that just sold, and it was an invisible sculpture. It sold for like a crazy amount of money, and it was an invisible sculpture.
There you go.
And there you have marketing circa pre-2020. And it's that piece of looking at, okay, people want to see that the emperor actually has clothes. And when you can show that all of those facets of you, and simultaneously, I do reference this in the book, if you have two separate sides, because of the strategy of how you are approaching your avatar, if you have two separate businesses targeting like two separate avatars. So fortunately, my coaching company and my agency, Communication Queens, have had the same avatar pretty much. So we haven't had to market to two different people. But if you're marketing to two different people, that's when you want to just have two separate one sheets, so that when you pitch yourself to one podcast, it doesn't look like this out of left field pitch. It's actually tailored to the industry, to the avatar, to the audience of that podcast. And also being able to look at bridging that divide in how do all these pieces of the story filter in together. So people see my career from going from Pilates instructor, and I only did that to support myself as a screenwriter, to becoming a published and produced screenwriter with Lionsgate, and Netflix picked up my first film as a screenwriter.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. It was really cool. And then after that, I was like, well, I co-wrote that movie, and now what's next? So I went into e-commerce. So I went into selling back stretching devices. And then I went into coaching when I had a successful exit from that company, and I was bought out 3 weeks before I got married.
Wow.
Jetted off on my honeymoon, started my coaching business, and then started our agency when we were stuck in Australia. And this whole journey, though, the through line has always been storytelling. I was changing people's stories about what was possible with their bodies with Pilates. I was changing people's stories through film narrative. I was changing people's stories through what was possible with further furniture with a functional back stretching chair. Like I was changing their stories in coaching. I was then broadcasting their stories with our agency. So there's this through line of storytelling has been consistent throughout my brand. So you want to be able to chunk up to see what is the through line of all of these pieces and then communicate to those pieces rather than to these small, like micro specifics. When you chunk up to, like, for me, I speak a lot on creativity, full authentic expression as a leader, conscious leadership principles. These principles run throughout every single bit, whether I'm writing a children's fart book or I'm, writing a best-selling book called Make Every Podcast Want You. Like it runs through every single one of them. So chunking up is necessary for you to be able to get those pieces to have cohesion.
Yeah, it's
Wow.
that. I was gonna say, I mean,
Yeah.
we've often heard like your vibe attracts your tribe, right? Like that's
Yeah.
what it is. It's your vibe. It's that through line, what shows up. And I know that you helped me uncover that for me, actually, Kimberly, right? We were talking, I was like, same, like that was me and what I was experiencing, like with the digital web agency and then being this transformation leadership coach and, even teaching business technology. I was like, okay, what, and then writing my children's book. And it was like, I was having these 4 categories and Carol very similar, right? It has like all these different components. And
Yeah.
you can either look at it down here in these like separate columns, or you take it one step up and you're like, okay, what is that through line? And I know we talked about like the authenticity piece, and the passion piece and just really like the efficiency with the productivity and not having the burnout. And so it's that invitation to just like go up a notch, that level, and really look at, okay, what is it? Because it really is you that is the common piece through all of that. And that's really what's going to be attracting people to your interview, to having your own podcast, having you speaking. And so it's that simple little thing, but yet it makes a massive difference. And as we know in neuroscience, right? Like it's the identity piece.
Yeah.
Right. And like that's so important in how you're showing up and even as you're pitching yourself, right? You get to see yourself as a guest on a podcast. You get to show up, right? And make decisions, take actions to create the result of being a podcast host. And some of the work like Karen and I do, and you talked a bit before, Kimberly, earlier about the vision. It's you setting that vision, making that declaration that this is what you get to create. This is what you want. And this is happening, right? And now it's about committing to this process, getting your book, right? Make Every Podcast Want You, and then really implementing, right? The action steps that you've outlined to support you in getting on podcasts, being seen, telling your story, and making an impact, making a difference in what you get to do with your story and your journey.
We're really multifaceted beings. It's touching on that. It opens up from us being limited to us being limitless, right? When we're including all these different aspects of ourselves. And I'm really noticing that as a trend, even in psychology, and that recognizing that we're integrated beings. And I know for Alex and I with, the neurocoaching that we do, it's not just about neuroplasticity. It's also about cellular plasticity. It's about heart, brain, gut connection. It's about mind, body, spirit connection. It's about frequency and vibration and how all of these things are combined. And if we're isolating them, I really like, the way you said that Kimberly has helped you with that, Alex, and that it's down here in these columns are these categories. But if you take it a step up, if you elevate it with this through line, then you're really opening up all these possibilities, which is incredible, right? And such a beautiful way of helping us to um, to feel free in our authenticity. Because I know for me, I've often limited myself, quite often limited myself. Oh, that's not on target. That's not on niche. I'm not speaking to the right person here. I'm not this or that or the other thing, even though it was authentically what was in my heart and what would have been a benefit of value to people. And that's the point, right? Bringing our value and our service. You have such an interesting story. I feel like if we keep talking with you here, you're gonna like, okay, you've been a Pilates instructor, you're a mom, you've lived internationally, you've been through great loss, you know, are a screenwriter now. Oh my goodness, right? And
Right.
you, and that just speaks to that diversity in our lives and how you've been able to put that to work, writing a children's book, and so that we get to know all of you. It's such a beautiful, beautiful picture that you've painted in this way. And I'm so thankful that you've shared this because it feels very freeing to hear these things. It feels very like, oh, I can just be me. And yet you're also doing it in a way that is crafted with an intention of gifting people, of serving people. And I think that is such an important piece to remember. And I was going to ask you something else, and I got so excited I completely forgot what else I was going to ask you.
Well, maybe while Carol takes a moment to think what the question was, I know we're going to wrap up here in just a minute, Kimberly. How can our listeners get in contact with you, to connect with you, learn more from you? And of course, where's the best place for them to go and order your book, Make Every Podcast Want You?
Yeah, so if you want to order the book, go to makeeverypodcastwantyou.com. I made it super easy. And then you will also be directed to get all the resources. Like I said, we have 10 extra bonuses, including a list of 10,000 podcasters that you can start reaching out to. So there are literally no excuses how you can not put this to work for you. Like it works when you work the process. And if you're interested in more of the coaching side, as far as what I do as a business coach, look at crownyourself.com and our Crown Yourself podcast on how to build your empire holistically and in alignment with your purpose, being able to chunk up, like I am the visionary's visionary. Like that's where I specialize in high level visionary strategy. And then if you want to learn more about podcast guesting, head on over to communicationqueens.com/podcast and subscribe to the Communication Queen podcast, which is all about communication tactics and strategies in order to really make podcast guesting work for you.
Wow. Okay, I did remember my question now. Thank you for sharing that. One of the things, actually, I think it might be more of a comment, but one of the things that I have noticed is that by being a podcast guest on several different podcasts, I'm not having to reach out hardly ever anymore. I've got podcasts that are pretty consistently contacting me. Have you found that to be the case for your clients, that not only are they putting that out there, but then they're starting to attract that as well?
Yeah. I mean, like attracts like. And so and also the benefit of that's also there's benefit to having your own podcast because you are known in that world, and it also establishes you as a consistent podcaster. There's the value of consistency, especially with how long you've been podcasting and how many episodes you have. It shows that you have common core values. And so I'm not surprised that you're seeing that consistent podcasters reaching out to have you on their show simply because you've been so consistent with having your show.
Yeah. We're in our third year. Yes. I don't know. Where are we, Alex? We're somewhere over 130 episodes or so, weekly episodes for over 2.5 years. So yeah, that consistency, right? I really appreciate that you're speaking into that and the power of that, because sometimes when you're playing that long game, you can be like, okay, where are we in the process? What are we doing again? What's our mission, our vision?
Is this even working? Yes, it's working, and it's success is made in the consistency. I believe that actually consistency is a spiritual principle.
Wow.
Because if you look at the universe, the nature is always consistent. There's always spring, summer, winter, fall.
Wow. 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 Well, with your kids now, are you training your kids to start to be podcasters? This is the big question that we all want to know right now.
My 7-year-old wants to start a podcast because he wants to be
Yeah.
an astronaut and a rocket scientist. And so he wants to interview astronomers, rocket scientists on his show. That will be his homeschool project for spring of next year. So we're lining up the scientists now. Apparently, some scientists, depending upon what they're working on, are under some pretty strict NDAs. So
Yeah.
we're finding the ones who can talk about planets and things because he has a very specific lineup of questions that he's already built. But my 3-year-old is a little too young to be starting a podcast, but you never know.
Yeah, that's right. That may be the one that surprises you.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, I'm definitely training my kids to be entrepreneurs. I already see it just because we homeschool both of them, and it's my son literally said that the other day we were making pumpkins for like jack-o'-lanterns for Halloween, and he was like, and his my husband was like, oh, and we can scrape the seeds out and plant them, and we can have a pumpkin garden. And then my son goes, yeah, and we can invite everybody over to come to our pumpkin patch, and they can pay us money to see our pumpkins and to take home a pumpkin. And I was like, all right, so we know who's the entrepreneur for sure.
You're seeing the plan build out already. The influence have impact.
Yep. I mean, you model what you know, so I'm not surprised.
Oh,
Well, Kimberly, we're so grateful to have you here today. We really appreciate you bringing all your insight and knowledge and wisdom, and showing up authentically, you, right, sharing your story and just being that example and permission. That was something that came to me earlier as you were speaking, right? Like being the permission, and for everybody, right? Be the permission, right? Whether it's for your little ones that are looking up to you, or your team that is looking up to you. Like there's people in your life that are looking up to you, and you can definitely make a bigger impact by sharing your story and just taking a risk, right? Taking that courageous action, putting yourself out there, and really seeing the greater impact you can create with your message and your story. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, Alex, Carol. It has been a pleasure. You two are phenomenal hosts, and I am so excited for the lives that this episode will touch.
Oh, we are too. All right, our ambitious leaders. We are so excited that you joined us today, and we know you received as much value as we did. I mean, look at all these incredible tips, and now there's a resource, a book with 10 bonuses that you can go grab right now to get yourself out there, to increase your visibility, to start to become a podcast guest. And we're so glad you're with us. We are so glad you're here with us. We love you, and we can't wait to bring you even more. See you next week. Ciao for now.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Unleashed Unstoppable podcast with your hosts, Alexandra Carter and Carol Register.
If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others. Post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review, and subscribe.
That's all for this episode, Wildly Ambitious Leaders. See you next week.